Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 63rd episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. And as many of you know, workplace bullying and combating it is something I feel has to be done as it impacts or can impact so negatively on people's mental health. And of course, it's Anti-Bullying Week from the 11th to the 15th of November. And more often than not, workplace bullying is something that's brushed under the carpet. And often we might ask ourselves, where's the tangible research in this area to really make changes? Which interventions work? And what does zero tolerance really mean in the workplace? Last year, I was invited to speak at the Ben Cohen Foundation Stand Up to Bullying Workplace Conference, where there were academics talking about this very subject and research in this area. And quite frankly, it was really music to my ears. So to join me today to talk about this more is Chloe Goh. Chloe is a work psychologist and doctoral researcher based at Loughborough University. From the beginning, Chloe attained her BSc in psychology at Loughborough and stayed on to complete an MSc in work psychology, during which she focused her thesis on exploring menopausal voice within the workplace and the implications this has for employee mental health and well-being. She was then offered the opportunity to complete a PhD exploring how to improve the effectiveness of workplace bullying interventions. Absolute gold dust. She's a self-confessed pro-academic. Chloe is highly motivated to translate research into feasible and practicable interventions that protect and promote the health and well-being of employees within organisations. In line with this, she also works as a consultant psychologist, advising and providing insights for organisations on workplace bullying and other forms of unethical workplace behaviour, workplace bullying interventions from design to preparation, implementation and their content, change management and in particular establishing readiness for change, workplace health psychology, health and well-being of employees at work, menopause in the workplace and the relevance of the employee voice within this, equality, diversity and unconscious bias within the work environment. So we are in for a real treat today, subjects that I really cannot wait to dig into. So Chloe, a huge welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'd really love it if you could start by telling the listeners what a pracademic is.
So I'm aware it sounds a bit gimmicky, but for me, a pracademic and something certainly that I would like to be, I guess I'd like to be more centered in, is somebody who wants to produce research that can be translated into feasible, practical, tangible solutions. And in my case, it's for organizations, because I kind of want to see my work being put to good use, so to speak. And I really hate the notion of research that's overly complex and hard to understand with big words and whatever. So for me, it's really just about making sure that my work is able to be understood and applied easily.
Yeah, fantastic. I think you're so right. There's so much research that isn't tangible, or that people think, I don't know how this applies to me, or that it's at such a level that, you know, people do need to have a PhD, or they do need to have, level 7 plus education. So I think it's great. And also, this whole rhetoric around, the liberal elite, what do they know? And I really like this term pracademic, because I think it shows that it's around making everyone's lives better.
Definitely. It's all about accessibility for me. We research things because we care about them, but let's make sure that everyone can be on it and be passionate about the same thing. I don't think we need to put it on a really high shelf that not everyone can reach. That's my priority really anyway, is just making sure that we can all kind of access it and use it and understand it.
Yeah, fantastic. And I read out in your bio that you started with menopause in the workplace, so that was one of your big areas. And now, of course, you do a lot of your research now is about workplace bullying and intervention. So, how did you start? How did you move? And there is an overlap, of course, because we know that many people who are experiencing menopause in the workplace will also be likely to, depending on their symptoms and depending on time off, etc., the things that they might need, may experience workplace bullying as well. So they're not mutually exclusive. But how did you start doing research then into workplace bullying interventions?
Yeah, you're quite right. So just to touch on that, you're very true in saying that a lot of people, depending on their symptoms for the menopause, do tend to see their performance deteriorate at work in various different ways. And obviously that can therefore make them more vulnerable to bullying circumstances. But with regards to actually how I came into researching workplace bullying interventions, I don't really have a wild story behind it. But as I said, I'm very interested and passionate in looking at ways to help organisations prevent and reduce instances that threaten employee health and wellbeing. And halfway through my master's, I was approached by who is now my supervisor, and he asked if I wanted to help him with a big project he was working on with a huge international organisation. And the project was looking at creating interventions centred around promoting dignity and respect in the workplace. And I found it super interesting, and we made a load of progress on it. And just as kind of that was tying up and my master's was coming to an end, I noticed there was a PhD advertised at Loughborough looking into this sort of thing, which was about workplace bullying interventions. Mm-hmm. So I decided to apply and just try my luck, really. And I was super surprised when I got the call to say I got it. I'll be brutally honest. But yeah, I'm super grateful I did, because it's been a really, really insightful journey since then. And I've really enjoyed it. So.
And you know, I mentioned it in the intro that we met at the Stand Up to Ben Cohen Foundation Stand Up to Bullying conference, and I was really, really impressed by the work that was going on in Loughborough. I didn't know, and again, it's that whole thing about why is it that people that are tasked with, you know, bullying policy so often in HR, and again, I've got a lot to say about. I don't think that's the only place it should sit, and I don't know what your thoughts are, but you know, why isn't there more research on this area?
I think it's tricky, but there's the research. I mean, I had this conversation with an academic a few months ago, actually. The research is kind of in a washing machine, and it's just kind of churning out or revisiting the same stuff. We haven't really seen anything kind of cutting edge come out for a long time. I think inherently one of the most difficult things is the lack of unified definition. That's a bit of a problem, because we can't quite agree on what it is exactly that we're trying to prevent. We know it's bullying and we know it's not good, but what one person says bullying, another person might say incivility, another country or academics in another country might say mobbing. So we're all kind of like passing ships in the night as it goes. But one thing that kind of unites us, I guess, is our want to kind of prevent and reduce this sort of behaviour and look after people. So we're united in that passion, but it's just kind of getting everyone on the same page at the moment that seems to be a tricky situation.
And that's a brilliant point, because one of the things I wanted to ask you was, you know, what does the term bullying, how do you define it in your research? And the second part to that question really is, do you think, because it's interesting, there's a kind of working definition, so for internal policies around bullying, and at the conference, this was a big point of discussion, wasn't it, around the legal term for bullying. So do you think there should be a legal definition for bullying? Would that help cases? Would that create more clarity in the UK?
So I think that's a great question. Bullying, I think, is so tricky because of its perceptual nature. And the fact that we don't have a unified definition does make it tricky. In my research, and particularly what I use in my thesis, is kind of an amalgamated definition that's been kind of developed and pushed and merged together over time from lots of different studies and practice. And that is, bullying is the systematic mistreatment of individuals where the target is subject to repeated, prolonged, negative social acts by one or more colleagues. And then to kind of reinforce that, we tend in academia to use examples to help classify that behaviour. And so there's certain characteristics, such as like the behaviour has to be repeated and prolonged. The target tends to have to be feeling like they are unable to escape or get out of the situation. It's kind of those sorts of things. But if I'm to break it down further and just simplify what it means to me personally, and if someone asks me, what is bullying? I just kind of, I see it as a form of, I look through a fairness lens, and I see it as a form of like unethical behaviour that falls outside of illegal workplace conduct, but it's inherently unfair. So for me, it's behaviour that seems unjust, it's unexpected, and not something that you would reciprocate to the opposing party. And that for me just helps remove the complexities and uncertainty of trying to pin something down and just keeps it simple. I do think it's important to note it doesn't take away from its complex nature at all. But it's just, rather than worrying whether the behaviour you've experienced has ticked all these boxes and, oh my God, is it just me being sensitive? Did they mean to not invite me to the meal? It's going, okay, let's take a step back a second and let's look at this. Was this fair? I don't think so. Would I do that to them? Well, no, I wouldn't. Okay, so I feel upset, and rightly so. And using that lens and that approach, people they feel less aggrieved and anxious about ensuring that it's within these really specific confines, and instead just have their feelings validated.
So I think you're so right about feelings validated, because I think often all people want to do is to be heard, and not negated, and not be told, not gaslighted, not be told, are you sure they meant it, or they're just a firm manager, it's this, it's just that. And this kind of organizational defensiveness that happens.
Yeah. And it's so true. And I think sometimes it's just like, okay, let's step away from the complexities, because it does tend to slip into this little grey area, and let's just look at it for, okay, that upset me. I wouldn't do that to them. I do feel it's unfair, and actually it's okay to feel like the way I do because of these reasons. And I think to go into the second part of the question, so regarding whether there should be a legal definition, I think that's super tricky, and it is such a hot topic of conversation. I do hope that if it is eventually brought into a legal definition, that it would take away the lackadaisical approach that tends to be taken with bullying cases, in that it's usually just given, like I just said, a big grey label with a question mark on it. It doesn't seem to enact much urgency, or as much urgency in organisations as illegal behaviours, for example, such as harassment or victimisation. And I also hope it might make more people mindful of how they interact with each other at work. And I also hope it might give those who are targeted more confidence to identify it and come forward. But I mean, additionally, we've seen with other things such as, sexual harassment, that specific definition has helped make a really positive difference in identifying and addressing such awful behaviour. But I am very aware that when legalities are tied to things, it can remove a lot of compassion out of the process. So it's like, oh, okay, you say you were sexually assaulted. Okay, well, sound the sirens, follow us down this really long, complicated process. Right, can you prove it? Did you have any witnesses? Well, they're saying they didn't do it. What do you have to say to that? Et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is perfectly understandable, I think, with regards to why it's needed for taking formal action. But what that then does is it makes it really difficult for people to want to engage in the process. And ultimately, it just puts the burden of proof on the victim, which makes it more traumatic for them. Now, I'm aware that this is the case with bullying accusations anyway, but I think ultimately it does make the burden heavier for the target. So I think the complex nature of bullying doesn't help the case either, because I think that would then mean you might have to cover every single potential behaviour that could be used to bully, which is tricky, because in some circumstances, these can be really innocent mistakes, missing someone off an email list, or, I mean, I don't know, my eyesight, for example, is awful. I can't see people's faces in the distance.
Neither can I.
It's like not seeing someone in time to greet them as you walk into the office. These are really innocent mistakes, but they could be deemed to be, microaggressions, or like people ostracizing others. And obviously these would then have to form part of a wider case. But if you did list all of the above, would that then mean that you'd have every employee with a spreadsheet, keeping a note of all their interactions with other people? I don't know. I know it sounds super far-fetched, but in terms of practicality, I'm really not so sure how it would play out. So I think I am a bit on the fence with it. I completely see the need for it, and I really hope it would make a difference. But I'm also very aware that the interventions we have out there at the moment aren't very effective. So I do wonder if once we've sorted out the efficiency of interventions, we may then be able to achieve a more organic result with regards to reducing and preventing the occurrence of bullying in the first place.
I think that's it, Chloe, isn't it? It's about the proactive as opposed to the reactive measures. Because again, I think, at that conference, even though it was a year ago, that the audience was split, wasn't it, around, yes, we should have a legal definition. Oh gosh, and a lot of legal practitioners thought, well, we know what we have isn't ideal, but because we've got a lot of case law and we know that there's a power imbalance involved and we know there's a hostile and derogatory behavior involved, that we have a broad enough framework, which means that people can be challenged for bullying. And again, people conflate the terms bullying, harassment and victimization. And it's so interesting when I do training, how people, again, I think it's not anyone's fault. I don't think the terms are clear enough, and I think they're used interchangeably in the press. So of course we know that harassment has to be around a protected characteristic. It could be a one-off event, it could be a prolonged event. Bullying could be one-off, but the likelihood is it's a prolonged thing, because you have to, again, the burden of proof, show evidence that someone has marginalized you, sidelined you, done something. I also think, we know in workplaces as well, if someone comes up to your desks and shouts in your face, as deeply as unpleasant as it is, it's quite clear cut. What do we see, particularly in higher education? The things you're talking about. So missing people off emails accidentally on purpose, the black member of staff in the team getting the most teaching load, all these things. So how do you really put your finger on it? So I don't know myself. And I was talking about this with a legal academic friend as well. And she said, good luck to the people doing it. But she said, I think she said, I can see cases for and against. And she just, as you said, it does make it quite tricky, because we know, particularly when we do bullying training, all the different types of bullying. You've got serial bullying, you've got gang bullying, you've got policy and procedures being used against people. So there's the list, punitive. Is it punitive or all these things that are there. So really fascinating to hear that from you. And then in terms of the research then on intervention, so Chloe, what are the things that work? And we started to talk a little bit about there, you mentioned proactive rather than reactive, which I'm totally with you. So what and I know your research is still ongoing, so feel free to share anything you want to about that, but also what interventions are really useful and are working, and that companies could adapt quite easily? Because I think the other thing is, this is not a rocket science in many ways, and it's not expensive to do. What's expensive is when you get to the other end and you end up in a tribunal.
Yeah, absolutely. There's such a clear business case for this. And so, out there at the moment, I think it's fair to say, I don't think this is too controversial, that we don't really have anything out there that's massively effective. We just don't.
Interesting.
I think one thing that did kind of harbour promising results was a crew intervention that I think took place back in, I think it was included in the systematic review in 2017. And I can't remember what it stands for, but I know it's civility, respect, and I don't want to say engagement, but it might be in the workplace, something like that. And it was all about trying to change attitudes. And it was what was good about it, or what I think are the key kind of factors to interventions, is they need to be longitudinal. So you've got to have measure points that go deep over time. So you can't just say, we're going to do a training course and that's it. It's got to be something that is going to be looked at and revisited for a long period of time, because this is inherently a behaviour. And if you are to change behaviour, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a matter of process. It's a matter of changing behavioural norms and values and all that sort of stuff. So it's got to be longitudinal. Another thing is it's got to be targeted at all levels. You can't just target it, managers, even though that's a very valid level to start at. But you need to look higher up in the organisation. You've got to make sure it trickles down. So these are some of the things that are key to try and make interventions more effective. But as you mentioned, this is something I'm studying. I am now very scarily in my final year of my PhD. And what I'm arguing at the moment is it's not necessarily the interventions and approaches that aren't effective. What I'm arguing is it's the organisations and environments within which they're being implemented. They're just nowhere near ready to address the issue. And that's the main problem. So when we look at workplace bullying interventions, I liken them, and I think you've heard me go on about this before, but I liken them to flowers. So how well, hear me out. So it's a bit cliche, but the way I kind of posit it is how well a flower grows is dependent upon the environment within which it's placed. So you can have a relatively rigorous, promising intervention, but if the organisation that's using it isn't ready, it's just not going to work. So I think the problem isn't necessarily, although it can be, with the interventions themselves, but it's actually the organisations running them. So it's more than just saying, we are ready to do some training because we've had a bit of a dodgy staff survey result. It's so much deeper than that. What you will find is a lot of organisations will have a dodgy result come through, or they'll have a couple of tribunals, and then they'll pay someone to come in and run a few training sessions, maybe a survey, and then expect that to be enough. But because bullying, like I said before, is such an inherently complex behaviour, preparation for it has to be deeper. It's got to be so much deeper than searching for LinkedIn for someone to come and run a session. It just has to be. So I think organisations need to look at themselves first. So things such as what cultural principles are we disseminating, and how does that then contribute towards the burgeoning of this behaviour? How is power allocated and enforced within our organisation? How rigid and fair are our procedures? Do our employees trust that our managers or leaders can competently handle their experiences? It's things like this. And I've actually developed a conceptual framework and process model that deciphers specific components that formulate readiness for workplace bullying interventions as part of my PhD. But because it's not finalised or published, I don't want to give too much of it away, but it is basically stuff like that. And what we're just trying to say is we're trying to encourage organisations to assess themselves more importantly, not employees, but themselves, through different lenses to try and establish whether they're actually really ready to take on a bullying intervention or not, because it is so much more than just running a training session, putting up some posters, telling someone off. It's deeper than that. So...
And the only reason I'm laughing is because when you said it's not about finding someone on LinkedIn and getting them in to do anti-bullying training, which has happened to me several times.
Oh no!
But you're right. I mean, you're right. And I don't do a huge amount of anti-bullying training anymore. But when I first started 3 years ago, full time in the business, that was a lot of the things that got me on my way. And it was mandatory training for everyone. And I know some people would turn up 3-4 times because they'd not been marked on the system properly. But I think I really like your approach about readiness, but also that it's one of those things where, again, people feel uncomfortable to talk about, along with sexual violence, domestic violence, racism, anti-disability behaviours. What is this about this discomfort around assessing the readiness to tackle bullying? I feel there's quite a British thing in the UK about, sweep it under the carpet. And why aren't people saying, we're not good at this? Actually, we do have a bullying culture. Everything comes from the CEO and they're autocratic and they like things done this way. Or the CEO is brilliant, but actually, our chief information officer, she's very, challenging and she likes things done in a particular way. And this is having an impact. Why are we not ready as a country, given that we've got so much information about behaviours, emotional intelligence? What's going on, Chloe?
Good question. I think if I knew the answer to that, I'd be very rich.
I was going to say you'd be very rich.
Yeah, please. I think first and foremost, when we look at how we perceive behaviours and how we perceive situations and the stigma attached to things, we kind of, we have to look at our own socialisation, but we also have to look upon which the environment within which we've been placed. So let's step right up to the top. Let's look at society. Let's look at societal values around bullying. There's a negative connotations attached to it. Workplace bullying is very, very different to an extent to school bullying, in that it's, for want of a better word, it's more sophisticated, it's more subtle. Playground bullying, someone's punched me, he's called me this, she's called me that. That tends to be how it works. Whereas in the workplace, it's very different, it's very subtle. People know the ins and outs of how to get away with it. And so that's why it's often, people's claims go, they get swept under the carpet. But I also think if we look at the reason why, I think one of the key reasons why organisations are so apprehensive to address it is because they lack the confidence, because they're not too sure what it is. I think they're scared that it will open a can of worms, and that, kind of like with the Me Too movement, it was like then everyone might come forward. But actually what you've got there is you've got to kind of flip it and look at the positives, because if everyone's coming forward, they're giving you so much to work with and it's telling you loads about your organisation. If you hide these sorts of behaviours, unethical behaviours, let's just categorise them all, what you're creating is these horrible pockets that just get deeper and deeper and deeper. And actually, it's a really important business case, because you're losing more money in terms of loss of productivity, short and long-term sick leave, turnover, all these sorts of things. So for me, it's about trying to give organisations the courage and also the accountability. You need to be held accountable for the well-being and the behaviours that your staff are exhibiting to an extent, because when they're within the confines of your organisation, they're representing you, and I think that needs to kind of come across. But I think one of the key things is money. That's often a massive factor behind the motivation of organisations to address this thoroughly, because if they have a damaged reputation, then they'll lose money ultimately because they lose investment and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's easier to brush things under the carpet and pretend like they don't exist and deal with the odd payoff of somebody in a tribunal than really go, yeah, do you know what, we've got an issue, let's look at it, help us out, I'm going to be really open and honest about this and I want to tackle it. So sometimes easier to just sweep under the carpet, but you're right, people don't want to be open and talk about it, and they're scared to come forward. There's a lack of psychosocial safety there, and I also think that that's probably attributed to the fact that we're still not quite sure what it is, and because it is largely perceptual, what one person says, this is really affecting me, I'm really struggling, another person's going, oh my god, why, it's fine, they're only joking. Do you know what I mean? So there's that huge discrepancy in perception as well, which makes it, it doesn't do anybody any favours in terms of coming up and speaking about this. That was a bit of a roller coaster answer, but I hope that. That's
brilliant. A really holistic view, and thinking about well-being. Then, we know that mental ill health can come about, or mental ill health can be exacerbated or develop as a result of bullying. Some people have experienced workplace bullying that's been so horrific they've developed post-traumatic stress disorder. So, what has your research shown then in terms of short-term, medium, and long-term negative impacts to mental health? And also, what can workplaces do about that in terms of supporting mental ill health if it develops or is exacerbated by bullying behaviours?
So I think that's a good question, and it's a very important question. I don't research specifically the impact it has on mental health and well-being per se, but it's obviously a super prevalent reason that forms part of the larger business case for organisations to effectively implement interventions to address it. So we know, and I mean, there's so much literature out there on this, but we know from literature that workplace bullying can significantly damage health, both short and long term. So it's been linked to psychological distress, things such as anxiety, depression, burnout, decreased self-esteem, decreased self-worth, low self-efficacy. It can cause suicidal ideation. It can also affect people's sleep quality, stress levels, which then triggers the additional physiological implications too. People are having strokes, they're having heart attacks, all sorts of awful things just caused by the additional stress that bullying causes them on top of their, on top of your job role too. Performance-wise, it can affect your cognitive functionality, meaning that your task performance is decreased. You're more likely to feel dissatisfied, disengaged, and ultimately unhappy and unsafe in your job. So that combined with, like, as you said, the trauma of it all, especially for not just for the targets who are arguably the most impacted, but those close to them, so family and friends, also the bystanders. A lot of people, in some circumstances, people are too afraid to stick up and get involved, and then they're living with the guilt. Other times, they maybe try to, but you can't quite beat the system, and so you still live with the guilt. So, there's a lot of impact that it can have on bystanders as well. But it can really ruin people's lives and evoke trauma years after it's happened, which should be of huge concern for all organisations. Given we will all spend the majority of our lives at work, there's a huge need for organisations to be open and proactive towards addressing it. And I think in ways in which they can kind of encourage or help protect and support people who are dealing with the health implications of it. I think the first thing, and what's really key for me, and I always switch back into my menopause research, but what I looked at with that was the notion of menopausal voice. And so that was like the ability and opportunity for menopausal employees to discuss their menopausal experience with their employer and also their colleagues. So how safe was it to be talking about this, and what impact did that lack of or ability to have on their well-being? And voice is incredibly powerful. If you can talk about things and externalize them and gain feedback, it helps you to process things better. And like we discussed earlier, it helps make your feelings validated, so it's reassuring. You're not sitting there going mad. And so I think we do need to work on creating a better voice climate for people to come forward and discuss unethical behaviour and their experiences at work. And have that validated. So and so did leave me off that email. Do you think they did it on purpose? And just being able, and without being able to articulate and discuss those things without being shot down, don't be ridiculous, they didn't mean it. Or like you said before, they're just a really stern manager, they want you to do well. They're not bullying you, they're just being strict. And it's about trying to encourage that notion of respect. And for me, again, it's really important, encouraging that notion of like looking at it through that fairness lens. Okay, whether or not we agree with what they're saying, let's be fair to them, let's hear them out, let them talk about it. Now, talking obviously isn't going to solve everything, but in terms of a support mechanism, if you create those active channels for voice horizontally for kind of your solidarity or your horizontal support with your colleagues, but then if you have that openness for your vertical voice, so speaking to managers and stuff, that can then trigger actions and adjustments and things that can then be put in place. And it ultimately shows them that, we are going to take this seriously. But then if you are going to create those channels, you need to then make sure that you've got sufficient interventions that can be triggered and put in place to support them. So it's not as simple as just letting people talk about it. There's a whole other thing that's got to be set up and ready, as I like to use, ready to go if people are going to use that channel, you know what I mean? So it's a really complicated issue, but it's not something that can't be done. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, it's about the readiness and the willingness again, isn't it? And you're so right. The point you said about family and friends though, and bystanders, because when I went through my I've been through several bullying's been one of the themes throughout my life actually, but
oh gosh.
Yeah. So but very subtle. She was a very manipulative woman. I mean, the great news is she did eventually get pushed out by the vice chancellor. So she got her just desserts, but it took five years after I'd left. But I mean, very, very subtle. If I tried to go anywhere, and because she'd been in the institution for a really long time, nothing would have happened. And I had things that made me feel awful, and I really felt that they were racially motivated, but I had no proof. And that thing, and even now I'm still bitter about it because there was loads of gaslighting. She was very nice to everyone in the team. She had an all-female team, so it was like, oh, look at her, she's so feminist, and she wasn't. It was all. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And so just when I remember just waking up in the morning and almost crying and saying I don't want to go to work, the impact that it has on the others around you is so significant. So I think you're absolutely right to mention that. And so this is very emotive work, as there's a lot of emotional load, a lot of mental load actually in this research. So Chloe, I'd like to ask you how you look after your mental health and what your top 3 tips are.
That's a good question. So I think one thing that's quite funny is despite my line of work, I think I would happily acknowledge that I'm still very much learning to get this right. But for me, there's kind of 3 key things that help me. So firstly, and I've just said it, and I think you've kind of got to live and breathe your research to an extent. Otherwise, you come across as a bit of a phony. But speaking to people about how I feel on a regular basis is something that I do very often. It's usually my mum, bless her. She's my soundboard for everything. And we do speak every single day. But I am fairly transparent with everyone I'm close to in my life, such as my partner and my friends. And doing this helps me to externalize what's going on in my head and also better rationalize my thoughts. And it just helps me to kind of unpick them and deal with them in an objective way rather than and helps to kind of remove the emotion that you might be experiencing. So that's one way, just speaking about how I'm feeling, getting some external feedback and validation. Or sometimes mum will be like, you're being ridiculous, like fix up a little bit, which is what you need. You do need that sometimes. And you're like, yeah, do you know what? You're all right. So that one thing is key. Always speaking to people and being open about it, about how I'm feeling and what's going on. Number 2 for me, bit cliche, but it's still valid. Exercise is super important to me. Keeping fit is a priority of mine. But regardless of that, I really notice how much my mood is affected when I don't exercise. So, it's not necessarily about going and Olympic lifting twice my body weight. It's even just getting out, going for a walk. If I'm at home, it's taking my dog out. It's just getting out in the fresh air and just being away from your desk for a little bit. I find it really cathartic. And I think if you can keep yourself physically stronger, you do feel a little bit better as well mentally. And then I think finally, and this is one thing that I've learned since starting my PhD, and it's taken me a while to kind of begin to grasp it, but I think I am starting to get there. But one thing that's key for me is just respecting my capacity, which sounds really simple, but some days I have absolutely no brain power whatsoever, which is really, like, it's just not ideal if you're doing a PhD, because you need to have your brain on point every day. But I've learned that rather than sitting at a desk stressing that nothing's coming out, or I can't focus, or I can't write something, or I'm reading it and it's going, I'm not retaining it. I've learned to just kind of walk away from it, respect that my brain, for whatever reason, doesn't fancy it. And I just do something else for a bit. And actually, it's learning that it's okay to do that. Because I think we live in an age where it's hard to escape the superhumans we see on social media who, they make millions and they're also elite athletes, but, they could also win Bake Off as well as Mastermind if they tried, sort of thing. And I'm not taking anything away from these people, because I think they're super talented and fair play to them. But what I do think is that then creates an overwhelming pressure to complete a million things a day and, to constantly be successful. And actually what I found most helpful is just respecting how you're feeling and acting accordingly. And I know it sounds really easy to say out loud, but I think sometimes we just need to try and free ourselves from the guilt a little bit and realize that, productivity and progress isn't always about excelling and getting constant results. It's a gradual process, isn't it? So it's patience and respect for yourself, I guess.
Lovely. I really like that point about almost self-boundaries and realizing that you can't be superhuman. And it's so true. In fact, I was reviewing something the other day that I'd written. So I do these 1-page plans and I'd put in it Layla to realize she's not Superwoman. So it's a work in progress here too, Chloe. So this has been such a fascinating discussion. And if people want to know more about your work and maybe, read your previous research, keep their eyes out for your research that's going to be out when you complete your PhD and the other things that you've done, how should they get in touch with you or find out more about your work, Chloe?
So I think they probably need to be a bit patient, because I don't know how long it's going to be before it's out, but I'm working on it. But email is usually best. So I think I've sent you over my details for that. But I also have Twitter. So I've got a Twitter that's aligned with my PhD, and that's at Chloe Go. So the E is a 3 and the O is actually a 0. I went back to 2000s tech speak because there was no username available. And then also I'm on LinkedIn. So just under Chloe Goff. So you should see me. I should appear if you type me in. But I'm pretty active on all 3 of those, and I'm always more than happy to discuss or talk to people about my research and how I can help and that sort of thing. So I think what's really important for me is that we're all in this together and trying to tackle and be proactive towards reducing this sort of behaviour, because it is something that can really significantly impact people's lives, and why would we not want to stop it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, completely. Like you said, there's a moral case, but there's absolutely a business case too if people think this is soft and fluffy. So thank you so much, Chloe. And all those contact details are in the show notes if you want to check them out or get in touch with Chloe. And of course, she'll be tagged into the posts on social media, so you can also find her there. I just want to say a huge thank you for sharing your knowledge and your time, because I also know you're super busy with other things. So we're so grateful that you could join us today.
No problem at all. Thank you so much for having me on. It's lovely to talk about it. And thank you for actually listening to me, because half the time I think you get so caught up in your PhD, you just feel like you're talking about it all the time. So it's nice that you're actually interested. Thank you.
No, absolutely.
Appreciate it.
No, absolutely. And thank you everyone for listening. So do remember this. This is, I think Chloe shared some real gems with us. And do check out her work and do get in contact with her, tweet her, share her work, because it's so vital. And we'll see you on the next episode, where we're going to be talking to Dr. Germaine Ravalier, talking more about, again, research-based initiatives on wellbeing in the workplace. So until the next episode, take care and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.